So you guys have a really good idea at this point about the sales comparison approach. So now we're going to look extensively at the cost approach. So what does cost mean? For business and accounting, cost is a little bit different than for appraisal. So when we're talking about just business and accounting, we have the price of something, what you actually pay for it. That is also referred to as the retail price. And then your retailers are paying what they call a wholesale price. So the wholesale price is going to be considerably less than the retail price because the wholesaler obviously is trying to make a profit. We have the original price of products. The original price is going to be the price that the retailers that they originally are trying to get for the product. But you guys know, as well as I do, most retailers have sales all the time. So you have an original price, but if you get something on sale, then obviously you're paying something less than that. And then we have book cost. What does it cost on our books as a retailer? This is the wholesale price, what you're actually paying for it. So what does cost mean in appraisal? The cost on the value date is going to be the cost the day of the actual appraisal report. So the day that the appraisal is completed, the day that it's submitted, that's going to be your market value. We also have typical cost versus actual cost. Think about the house that we actually went out there and measured and took notes on. Okay? That is a spec house. A builder built that house hoping that a buyer would come along and want to purchase it. So did he use the best materials? No. Did he use the best flooring? Did he use the best countertops? No, he didn't, because he wanted something. He wanted a typical cost so that he would have a profit built into that when someone makes an offer on that house. Now, what if he had framed that house and then had a buyer who came in and said, I really like the floor plan on this property, but I want to make some upgrades. So instead of putting in that vinyl faux looking floor, right, faux wood floor, then maybe they would have put in actual hardwood floor. Or maybe instead of a Formica countertop, they would have put in a granite countertop. So in a situation like that, you have a typical cost where you have the cost of what you would see on a regular spec house, and then you have the actual cost where someone has come in and maybe they've made some upgrades. So the actual cost is a lot more. We then have consumer level cost. So this is going to be charges to the buyer, not just the cost to the builder or to the developer. And then we have a cost as new. So if a property is brand new, what is the cost to actually construct it? And there again, that goes along with the typical cost and how much of a profit is the builder actually throwing into that. And then the actual cost can change if you have someone who comes in at the right phase where they can make their own modifications. This slide is just giving you a little additional information about what I just talked about on the previous slide. This slide, we have 5 different steps in the cost approach. But here's what you really need to remember. In the cost approach, you add land and you subtract depreciation. This is the one approach to appraisal where the value of the land is given separately from the improvement. So we're going to add the value of the land back to the replacement cost that we have found for the actual structure. Now, the structure may not be new, okay? If the structure is brand new, we don't have to consider depreciation. If the structure is not new, we do have to consider depreciation. So depreciation is going to be the loss in value that happens because the property isn't new, and over time we see depreciation in improvements. So we're going to talk more about depreciation in Chapter 12, but this slide is just showing you the basic steps in the cost approach. So just remember, add land and subtract depreciation. Now we're going to talk about the difference between reproduction cost and replacement cost. So the first one here is reproduction cost. Reproduction cost is reproducing an exact replica. So this is where you're making a duplicate of something. See where they have a copy machine here on the slide? They're making a copy of it. So it's going to look exactly the same. Reproduction cost is not going to be used as much when you're building a house, right? Because does it really make sense to duplicate a house exactly? No, right? So that brings us to replacement cost. So here we have replacement cost. Replacement cost is replacing the utility or the similar use of the improvement. So here we have a guy, it looks like he's changing tires. So this is the example that I always like to use, right? You've probably gotten tires before. Now, there's lots of different types of tires that you can buy, right? You can get Goodyear tires, you can get Michelin tires, you can get used tires, right? they're all going to replace the utility of the tires that you're taking off of your car to put the new ones on, right? They're replacing the function. They don't have to be exactly the same. They just have to serve the same function, the same utility. So that is what replacement cost is all about. So when we talk about that in relation to housing, if you have a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house with a 2-car garage, we can compare that to another 3-bedroom, 2-bath house with a 2-car garage, right? They have the same usefulness. So that is replacement cost. So here we have an advanced art form, that's a joke, an example of the subject property, reproducing an exact replica of it versus just replacing the utility of it. So when do we use the cost approach? If you're valuing a brand new property and there's not any comparables, then cost approach may be appropriate. If we are valuing a special purpose property, for instance, if it's a church or a school or a bank, these are properties that are not typically bought and sold. So if you don't have any comparables, how are you going to use sales comparison, right? I think I gave you guys the example not long ago of a church that was for sale in Twin City. There aren't any other churches to compare it to. So whenever they receive an offer on that and they are trying to do an appraisal to figure out the value, they're going to have to use cost approach. Another reason another time when you might use cost approach is going to be a check against other approaches. So most of the time, whenever an appraiser is doing an appraisal of something, he's going to do actually 2 approaches to appraisal in every appraisal he does. So whenever they're doing sales comparison, they're also going to do a cost. If they're doing income, they're probably also going to do a cost, or they might do income along with sales comparison. But it's used as a check against other appraisal approaches. Now, the numbers are not going to be exact, but they should be pretty close to one another, and that's what we're looking for, just as a checks and balances. I have another slide that's showing us the basic steps in the cost approach. So first they have here estimating the value of the land, and then we're going to figure out what the replacement cost of the actual structure is. So whenever we're figuring out what the replacement cost of the structure is, we have to know the square footage of the structure, and we also need to know the cost per square foot. So this is how we calculate replacement cost, and we're going to learn about different ways that you can come up with those numbers. You're then going to estimate what the depreciation of the property is and subtract that, and then you're going to add your land value back. Okay, so these are just the basic steps. Figure out exactly how much the land is worth, figure out how much the improvement is worth, okay? Subtract the depreciation if it's not a brand new improvement, and add the value of the land. Now, there's lots of different ways that you can estimate the cost. So these are some examples of cost estimating methods. The first one that we have is a comparative square foot or comparative unit method. Then we have the unit in place. We have the index or the cost service index method, and then we have quantity survey. So let's talk about each one of those. First one that we have here is the comparative square foot method. This is used most by appraisers as well as real estate agents. So this is the amount per square foot. So I've talked about this a lot. If I have a house that I'm trying to price and it's 2,000 square feet and all of the other houses in the neighborhood are selling for $100 a square foot, right? Then I'm going to apply $100 to 2,000 square feet, $200,000 house. Comparative square foot method. This is the easiest one. Well, then we have the unit in place method. So this is the price per section of improvements. So this is actually really good for estimating cost on industrial buildings because they vary widely in size. The shape, the height, the value with square foot method can be harder to determine. So unit in place makes a lot of sense. I kind of think about unit in place the way that a subcontractor would look at a property. Say, for instance, we have a subcontractor who is an electrician, and he's only going to do the estimate for the electrical portion of the building. He's not going to estimate anything else. He's not the roofer, he's not the plumber, he's just the electrician. So he's going to give you a precise number of how much it's going to cost if you hire him to do the electrical in that building. That is an example of a unit in place. So if you have different components, the floor, the walls, the roof, the electrical, the plumbing, these are all separate examples of a price per section of the improvement. The third one here is the index method. So this is the price according to the original cost. There's estimates for unique structures when costs are known, and there are indexes that you can actually refer to for different parts of the country that will give you ideas of what the cost is for a particular structure. And this is all information you can get online. You also have the quantity survey method. So this I would look at from a general contractor's perspective. If you have a general contractor who is overseeing the entire project, then he's going to go to individual subcontractors, the carpenter, the plumber, the electrical guy, the roofer. He's going to go to all of these different individuals. They're going to give him a specific quote, and then he's going to combine all of that together to figure out exactly how much it's going to cost for the entire project. So quantity survey is rarely used by appraisers. It is used mostly by contractors. And so it is the most extensive, the most complex type of cost method that you can possibly do. When you're estimating the cost, appraisers have to consider not only the direct cost associated with the structure, but also the indirect cost associated. So when you're talking about construction, direct costs are going to include things like labor, materials, equipment, design, subcontractors' fees, those kinds of things. We also have indirect cost elements. Here are some examples of the indirect costs that I mentioned previously. So indirect costs are going to be things like legal fees, appraisals, building permits, licenses, the interest that you have to pay on the loan that you've received if you've received a loan to do the construction, the insurance, the taxes, the overhead, the profit, the cost to sell the property if you're listing it with a real estate agent. So there's lots of different indirect costs that are also associated, and appraisers have to consider those. What are the variables that actually affect cost? So there's lots of different things that can affect the cost. The design or the use type of the building itself can affect the cost. So, I mean, you could be talking about an auto showroom, a bank, a car wash, a garage, a hospital, an industrial building, a residential building. All of these are going to be different because they're such different uses. You could also talk about hotels and motels. By the way, do you know the difference between a hotel and a motel? Hotels have the doors on the inside and motels have the doors on the outside. Just a little fun fact for you. Also, construction class, that's going to make a difference. So there's several different construction categories. You can have A, B, C, D, S, right? We talked about those when we talked about construction. Also, the quality of the construction. Is it good? Is it average? Is it fair? Is it poor? What is the size, the shape, the height of the building project? Are there yard improvements? So yard improvements would include things like a sprinkler system, perhaps. Is there shrubbery in the front and not in the back, or do they put shrubbery all around the house? So there's lots of different cost variables that you need to consider. You know that the actual size of a structure can affect the cost. So here's an example of a small building versus a larger building and the cost differences and how the size can actually affect the cost. So the first thing that we have here is we have a small building that is a 50 by 50. The floor is 2,500 square feet at $7.50 a square foot. The roof is the same size at $15 a square foot. The walls are 200 linear feet at $262.50 a linear foot. So when you calculate all of that and add it up, you have a total cost of $108,750. So if you divide that by the square footage of the building, you're going to get $43.50 per square foot. That is a smaller building. The larger building is going to be a 100 by 100. Now, the components, the amounts that you're paying for the components, the floor, the roof, the walls, those amounts are all the same. But because the building is so much bigger, when you multiply all of this out and divide it by the square footage, you're actually paying less per square foot. So this is really important when you're talking about warehousing and things like that. If you're talking about a large warehouse versus a medium-sized warehouse, it could make more sense just to go ahead and build the larger one because it's going to cost less per square foot. The shape of a building, that can also affect the cost. So here we have a building that is 50 by 200. So this would be a really good example of like a warehouse situation. And it's exactly the same size as the one we looked at on the previous slide. It's 10,000 square feet, right? The component amounts are the same for each one, but because it's long and skinnier, you're actually going to pay a little bit more per square foot. So it kind of just depends on whatever the project is that you're doing. You need to look at different options because it could be that you could save yourself a little bit of money. Here we have some examples of some common house shapes. I believe that the house that we appraised is probably one of those more 10-corner house. It had more corners on the front than it did the back. The back was pretty straight. But these are common types of shapes that you see in housing. Every once in a while you'll see something extraordinary or unusual, but typically this is what you're going to see. Online data services are becoming more and more commonly used by appraisers. So there are lots of different services that you can utilize online so that you can help yourself get cost estimates for particular types of projects.